My paper discusses the role of trauma and violence in the occupied territories. Thank you. And the ramifications on Palestinian identity, what that holds for the future and peace. I focused on the north in Nablus, and my group, if you will, were male students at Anaja University. Basically, my theory is that a traumatized society does not have the emotional means of engaging in lasting peace. And although both sides claim to be traumatized, the Israeli and Palestinian sides, I looked at only the Palestinian side for lack of space in a master's thesis. It's important to note that this postulation compels a more detailed analysis of the interrelation between two social identities, the Palestinian and the Israeli. Though I'm only presenting one. Furthermore, the study associates Palestinian trauma with two psychosocial experiences of identity. One is premised on the idea of inherited memory as a performed narrative, as a transgenerational relationship between the past, the present, and the future that has collapsed down into a repeating present. And the other presupposes first-hand exposure to the Israeli occupation, to violence. I endeavored to correlate notions of identity with concomitant conflict and violence from the ongoing occupation, and then measure its effects on the conflict, on the particularly susceptible portions of Palestinian society, in an attempt to illuminate the feasibility of peace as a new Palestinian paradigm. First, though, I'd like to define trauma. Obviously, everybody has experienced some form of trauma, especially here. It's defined typically as a deeply distressing or disturbing experience, often one that causes emotional or physical shock and can potentially lead to long-term neurosis. Now, while that's a clinical definition, a psychological definition, it's also very violent. Trauma is violence. It's a psychological, internal violence. On an individual level, trauma questions the very foundations of self-consciousness, disrupting an individual's capacity for learning and absorbing new experiences. On a communal level, Dr. Volkan and others, professionals in the field, believe trauma throws into question fundamental perceptions of the group and results in regression into rigid notions of us and them, good versus the bad other. Such a history of collective trauma is typically associated with a security threat. These threats encompass a wide spectrum of possible meanings that may include prejudice, the denial of rights, and even expulsion or extermination. Here we have all of them. Moreover, these threats all raise the essential question of legitimacy, the right for a group to exist as it sees itself. Identity then becomes the conduit through which threats are experienced. In the case of Palestine, identity functions primarily due to the putative Israeli threat to the existence of the Palestinian nation. It is therefore born and perpetuated immediately at the extreme and violent end of the spectrum of association and reflection to the Israeli other. In this regard, identity remains a predominant rhetorical tool for attempts to demarcate political or social communities, claim rights of self-determination, and legitimate rule by reference to the people of a country. As is documented, identity plays a leading role in determining the psychic and political outcomes of a conflict.
Could you please slow down because of the translation?
Okay.
I will give you 5 minutes.
Dr. Vamik Volkan, who works on social identity theory, he talks about the intergenerational transmission of trauma, where trauma from one generation gets passed down from generation to generation if it can't be resolved. I believe that this is the case in Palestine with the Nakba in 1948. The inability to effectively mourn the loss of Palestine in 48, memorialized by the Arabic term al-Nakba or Catastrophe, and the subsequent transgenerational transmission of its associated trauma, functions to ensure social cohesion and promote emotional regression. Please tell me if I'm going too fast. The mythological evolution of the catastrophe, coupled with stories of pre-48 Palestine, house deeds, keys, smells, tales of the Hijra, all reflect shared memories meant to institutionalize the trauma, entrench the shame, helplessness, and anger, hence entrench Palestinian identity to the point of becoming a societal and political expression or ideology. In essence, Palestinian identity serves to perpetually re-traumatize itself in the interest of group solidarity. Although the Nakba has shifted in meaning over the years, the predominant function of the Nakba in its history, in the Palestinian history. This historic relationship remains both hot and acute due to the continued Israeli occupation, which augments the likelihood of volatile self and group identification. Theirs is a specific trauma, yours I should say, that bonds and transmits those bonds from one generation to the next. Physical violence. In this way, physical violence has been paramount to the traditional Palestinian narrative. First, in the act of being forcefully displaced from homes and villages. Second, in the formation of political militias like Fatah, PLO, and later Hamas, who took up arms to actively engage and defeat the Israeli oppressor. Third, in the daily aggression of occupation. And fourth, in individual and collective outbursts of resistance against the occupation like the Intifadas. It might well be added that the more recent bloodshed associated with factionalism between Palestinians is a direct result of this history of violence. Actively engaging in reciprocal violence as a measure to achieve certain goals seems to legitimize force and coercion as acceptable tactics in resisting occupation and/or repossessing land already taken by Israel, and by force. It is also a means of generating much-needed self-esteem by being able to kill, hence master, an enemy who has long used violent subjugation as his modus operandi. My fieldwork, by focusing on university students for my fieldwork, in a city ravaged by the Israeli occupation, my paper seeks to highlight the problematic nature of a culture imbued with violence, mostly through no fault of its own, yet seeking peace. Young men especially embody this discrepant relationship given their roles as both resistance fighters and students working towards a better future. The fieldwork presented here further demonstrates that old narratives of loss and pain passed down from preceding generations and perpetuated by the ongoing occupation enforce both self and group consciousness around a rigid us-them paradigm. Even so, research appears to indicate that these young men all share a rising awareness that stringently maintaining this identity construct actually nurtures hostilities. As a result, there is evidence of a growing discrepancy between the national narrative of victimhood that insists on Israel as enemy and the desire for peace and prosperity. However, analysis seems to also suggest that given no alternative avenue to address and contextualize their personal experiences of trauma, students will continue to adhere to the national rhetoric as a means of giving their lives and their suffering both individual and collective meaning. I went about my research by doing 6 personal interviews and 4 surveys at Naja with male students. Nablus students, again, I'm sure you're aware of a lot of this, but they've lived all their lives in warlike conditions. Nablus has been locked down in a siege-like atmosphere with roadblocks, and they've all witnessed direct trauma. They've lived through the failures of various peace initiatives. Most of them have not been able to leave Nablus. If they have, they've been able to go as far as Ramallah. Many have never been to Jerusalem. This chronic exposure goes beyond individual conceptualizations of trauma and augmenting a collective mentality that is at once personally and socially legitimizing through its pain. My surveys indicated that about 62% of the people I surveyed, of the men I surveyed, crossed checkpoints to get home every day. 57% had been arrested. The average time of number of days of arrest were 507 days. 44% had been shot or shot at. Only 26% had been arrested or had been, their houses had been raided, though 91% had witnessed a house being raided. 65% claimed that they had thrown stones at the Israelis, and 89% claimed that they had participated in a public demonstration. These events, they all claimed, had strong influences on their lives. I want to take a moment and say that the notion of bearing witness is an interesting element component of the Palestinian occupation. Although almost everyone in the West Bank has some sort of personal experience with Israeli occupation practices, they also all witness these actions committed against relatives, friends, and neighbors. Previous studies on the effects of witnessing trauma have been demonstrated to lead to maladaptive coping strategies and symptoms in Palestinian children, as was explained by my previous panelists. Due to the prevalence of aggressive Israeli military tactics, interviewed students all expressed slight exasperation with questions of whether or not they had witnessed events like arrests, house raids, demolitions, and other violence. One student repeatedly rolled his eyes at me and responded, I was in the main cafeteria where there are hundreds of students. He said, of course, we all have. Unlike previous studies that focus on the trauma of occupation, my present investigation of male students is not meant as an official diagnostic analysis of symptoms related to PTSD or other psychological disorders, nor is it meant as a treatment assessment plan. These results are meant to shed light on trends involving collective response patterns as opposed to specific individual or group sequelae, and how this relates to self-expressed notions of identity. As such, symptomatology is presented in its sociological and political context as a piece to the overall puzzle of Palestinian identity. It serves as a gauge for the understanding of the Israeli occupation as an overarching and ongoing trauma. This belief that occupation is synonymous with trauma is inherent to student perceptions of Palestinian nationalism and sustains the following discussion. The students all expressed extreme anger, depression, loss of concentration, and they bottled up their feelings. Yet the overall trend was that they didn't express anything. Given the choice between 16 feelings, they all experiencing them all of the time, most of the time, sometimes, little of the time, or none of the time. The majority of students said sometimes. What is noteworthy of the nausea results to the symptom survey is the overall unremarkable nature of the responses and their dissonance with written and oral narratives of specific trauma. Additionally, the surveyed students cautioned that due to the repetitive and unpredictable nature of the occupation, they felt and sought out a sense of detachment as a means of coping with the chronic anxiety that results from a loss of control. This numbness to the constant uncertainty and fear associated with occupation may also be read in the popularity of the sometimes response. Sometimes is non-committal, neither a yes nor a no, more like a maybe. In fact, given the various social and emotional constraints, sometimes seems to reflect an uncertainty over how to feel at all. This distancing from the personal is reflected in the existing literature on group trauma and suggests that students use shared narratives as a primary coping mechanism. In doing so, students are able to temporarily deal with traumatic experiences, since everyone around them has also encountered some measure of trauma, by passing these events off as normal occurrences, despite their abnormal nature. Yet, the insidious nature of trauma persists in affecting students in some measure. It perpetuates anxiety, fear, and helplessness, with anxiety being a primary and persistent symptom. This, in psychiatric terms, is called a constant state of hyperarousal. The two most salient features that emerge from this data are the overwhelming number of subjects who have directly experienced some form of severe trauma due to Israeli occupation practices, and the dual response pattern of these subjects as related to symptoms and identity, regardless of the incident frequency. One being a common social syntax highlighting anger and resentment due to years of suffering. The other, a more private inclination towards peace, or the status quo, due to overwhelming exhaustion and the desire to survive and prosper in the here and now. These results emphasize Dr. Volkan's belief that collective trauma becomes institutionalized as a social consciousness. His notion that chosen trauma is transgenerational and leads to perpetual mourning has clear implications for the current demographic. The social and emotional regression that results from this maladaptive mourning is reflected in the data by the persistence of violence as a societal narrative. According to the data, this violence is systemic and endemic. Palestinians experience aggression at the hands of the enemy Israelis, and they then perpetrate violence in the putative name of defense and liberty. However, the data also illustrates a growing willingness to accede to a newer narrative of peace and coexistence. Correlating events with symptoms and identity constructs, research seems to reflect that the subject population, the future leaders of Palestine, find themselves caught between these two narratives, not quite sure which way to go. As a result, individual self-awareness seems to include a greater appreciation for peace with Israel, while social identity still revolves around an antagonistic relationship with Israel as the enemy other. Based on the results of the symptomatology survey, the current study on students from Naja indicates that effects of trauma have adopted a collective tone. This communal perception of danger and anxiety, along with shared and witnessed accounts of humiliation and helplessness, purposely inflicted by Israeli soldiers and settlers, had two main outcomes among the surveyed demographic. The first was a strong belief in the idea of Palestine as an embodied ideal. The second was the notion of victimization. These two psychological effects of trauma were reflected in student characterization of the word Palestine. Palestine was the mother. It was an embodied ideal. It was perfect. What does this say about the debate over established notions of irredentism versus newer constructs of peace? Based on the data, it appears that students have mixed feelings regarding which viewpoint to take. As one student pointed out, it is easy to want peace, but not so easy to believe in it. Echoing this sentiment, I observed a palpable and growing sense of resignation looming over these students regarding the future. Interviewed students claimed that their shared anxiety of the future had two main impacts on their social group. First, it fostered the belief that well-educated young men must be responsible for creating a better domestic system, and are thus indispensable to the peaceful resolution of the conflict. Second, it paradoxically stirred up feelings of despondency. Despite anything constructive they might achieve, they were afraid that it still would make no difference. These convictions not only reflect the collective conviction that Israel is not a reliable partner towards peace, it also demonstrates a growing disillusionment with existing Palestinian social structures, official or otherwise. We can conclude that the traditional Palestinian narrative elicits certain axioms concerning the Israeli other and violence. First, Palestine and Palestinians are the faultless victims of gross human rights abuses perpetuated by Israel. Second, this abuse originates with the dispossession of homeland associated with the Nakba, which has come to represent inconsolable loss. Third, violent resistance has become socially institutionalized as a means of repossessing lost esteem, honor, and territory. Fourth, young men epitomize the lost virility associated with autonomy, statehood, ownership, and the potential for adaptive psychic development. And fifth, the consistent failure of resistance has provoked a literal and metaphysic passing of the torch to the next generation. Despite the persistence of this discourse, the overriding desire for peace has seeped into the political and cultural self-expressions of many students, creating an alternative refrain to the typical narrative of physical resistance. The preceding research indicates that given the choice, a majority of students would prefer a peaceful resolution to the conflict, one that allowed for two independent states living and working side by side for joint political and economic gain. A conviction in the validity of universal human rights sustains these desires, further manifested by the student popularity of nonviolent demonstrations. Many believe that ignorance on the part of the average Israeli citizen helped propel the continuation of the occupation. Opinions on the peace process and the infighting between Hamas and Fatah elicited further proof that students are desperate for normalcy in their lives, something they believe can be achieved only through peaceful means. Many claim that violent resistance just provokes the Israelis into harsher reprisals, such as long curfews, military incursions, more arrests, and the blocking off of certain sections of the city. The difference between personal memory and collective memory helps explain the discrepancy between positive attitudes towards peace and the continued popularity of aggressive discourse. Research indicates that students are able to accept certain changes to the Palestinian social identity, which is the focus on peaceful coexistence, on an individual level, but are not yet capable of integrating these ideas into the collective consciousness. As a result, social memory continues to promote regressive emotional development by resituating the devastating loss, helplessness, and anger associated with the Nakba into the occupied present. We can therefore summarize that the traditional narrative of collective loss provides clarity and connection in an otherwise unstable and confusing environment. As a result, perceptions of the conflict remain mired in the semantics of the established national discourse, evil enemy versus innocent Palestinian. Although personal, public, and governmental actions reflect a new focus on attempted cooperation and diplomacy, the collective understanding of historical and contemporary events still betrays those maladaptive psychic processes that further a mentality of violence and aggression.